When an arrogant young heir cornered a terrified waitress in an empty diner, he thought his money and his massive bodyguard made him completely untouchable. He ignored the quiet man sipping black coffee in the shadowed back booth. It was the biggest mistake of his life. Because that quiet man was an active-duty Navy SEAL, and the dark German Shepherd resting silently at his feet was about to show them what real power looks like. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you are watching from, and if you love stories that melt your heart, please subscribe to support our channel. The diner bell jingled a familiar tired tune as the evening dragged on. Lydia wiped down the laminate counter for the third time in an hour. She was a young waitress with a messy bun of brown hair and an apron stained with coffee spills. At 22 years old, she worked double shifts just to keep the lights on in her small apartment. The diner was mostly empty tonight. The neon sign outside buzzed a dull red against the dark street, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. In the far back booth, a regular customer sat in absolute stillness. His name was Wyatt. He was a broad-shouldered man with close-cropped hair and the quiet alertness of an active-duty Navy SEAL. He wore simple jeans and a faded gray t-shirt. He did not talk much. He just drank his black coffee and observed the room. Resting on the floor right beside his boots was a large, well-trained German Shepherd. The dog had a sleek coat of black and tan and eyes that missed nothing. The German Shepherd lay perfectly still, a silent guardian blending into the shadows of the booth. Lydia liked having Wyatt and his dog there. They brought a sense of safety to the late shifts. Safety was something she desperately needed lately. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with 5 new text messages. All of them were from Julian. Julian was her ex-boyfriend. He came from a family of extreme wealth and influence. He was a tall man with a sharp jawline and an arrogant posture. He was used to getting whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. When Lydia finally found the courage to leave his controlling grasp a few days ago, he did not take it well. The text messages were a constant stream of demands and veiled threats. She shoved the phone back into her pocket, her hands shaking slightly. She just wanted to finish her shift, lock the doors, and go home to try and sleep. The rain started to tap against the large glass windows of the diner, adding a rhythmic drumming to the quiet hum of the refrigerators. Wyatt took a slow sip of his coffee. He noticed the way Lydia kept checking her phone. He noticed the tremor in her hands. A man trained to spot distress signals easily recognized them in the young waitress. He gave a subtle hand signal to his German Shepherd. The dog shifted its weight, raising its head just a fraction, ears twitching as it listened to the ambient sounds of the room. The diner bell did not jingle this time. The front door was shoved open with such force that it slammed against the wall. The sudden noise made Lydia jump and drop her rag to the floor. Julian walked in. He wore a tailored designer suit that looked entirely out of place in a roadside diner. His hair was perfectly styled, but his face carried a twisted look of arrogance and anger. Behind him stepped a massive man in a dark suit. This was Julian's personal driver and bodyguard. The driver had the thick neck and flat nose of a veteran brawler. Lydia took a step back, her heart pounding against her ribs. She looked around the empty diner. The cook had already gone home for the night. The manager was in the back office doing inventory. It was just her, Julian, the bodyguard, and the quiet man in the back booth. Julian walked straight toward the counter. He did not look at the menu. He did not look at the empty tables. His eyes were locked entirely on Lydia. He stopped right in front of her, leaning his hands flat on the sticky surface of the counter. "Are you ignoring me, Lydia?" Julian asked. His voice was low but filled with venom. Lydia swallowed hard. "I told you we are done, Julian. Please leave. I am working." Julian let out a dry, mocking laugh. "You do not tell me when we are done. You do not just pack up your cheap little bags and walk out on me." He gestured to the heavy-set driver behind him. The driver stepped forward, crossing his thick arms. The physical threat was clear. Julian was not here to order food. He was here to break her spirit. In the back corner, Wyatt set his coffee mug down on the table. The sound was quiet, almost imperceptible, but the German Shepherd immediately stood up. The dog did not bark. It simply locked its dark eyes on the two men at the front of the diner. Julian reached across the counter, trying to grab Lydia by the wrist. She pulled back quickly, stumbling against the coffee machine. "Do not make this difficult," Julian snapped. "You're coming with me right now." Lydia shook her head, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. "I am not going anywhere with you. Leave me alone." The bodyguard took another step forward, cracking his knuckles. Julian smiled a cold, calculating smile. "Where is the bag, Lydia?" he demanded. "The old leather one you took from my apartment. Hand it over, and maybe I will not have my man here smash this place to pieces." Lydia stared at him in confusion. She had grabbed her own cheap purse on the way out, nothing of value to him. "I do not know what you are talking about," she stammered. Julian slammed his fist on the counter, making the sugar shakers rattle. "Do not lie to me. Give me the bag." The driver cracked his knuckles again, stepping around the counter to corner her. The atmosphere in the diner shifted from quiet isolation to immediate danger. Julian thought he had complete control of the room. He thought he was the most powerful person in the building. He had no idea that a highly trained military operative and a combat-ready German Shepherd were watching his every move from the shadows, ready to strike. Julian leaned closer over the worn laminate counter, his expensive cologne mixing abruptly with the smell of stale coffee and fried food. He did not belong in a place like this, and his posture made it clear he wanted everyone to know it. He was a man accustomed to vaulted ceilings and private dining rooms, not flickering neon lights and cracked linoleum floors. "I am losing my patience," Julian said smoothly, though the underlying edge in his voice was unmistakable. "You have something of mine. A bag. I want it back right now." Lydia clutched the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. The surface was cold against her palms, grounding her slightly as she tried to steady her erratic breathing. She forced herself to look him directly in the eyes. "I told you I only took my own things when I left. I left everything you ever bought me back in your apartment. The designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, the gifts. I left all of it right on the bed." Julian let out a sharp, condescending breath. He looked around the empty diner, his eyes sweeping past the vacant booths, with utter disgust until they rested briefly on the shadowed corner where Wyatt sat. He dismissed the quiet man immediately as just another irrelevant nobody. That assumption would soon prove to be his greatest mistake. "I do not care about the clothes or the cheap jewelry," Julian spat, bringing his attention sharply back to Lydia. "I care about the old leather tote bag, the one you always carried your books in. You took it when you walked out. I know you did." Lydia frowned deeply, genuine confusion crossing her tired face. It was just an old, battered thrift store bag she had used for years before she even met him. The leather was scuffed, and the strap was heavily frayed. Why did he care about it so much? Why would a man who wore custom Italian suits track her down in the middle of a storm for a worthless piece of luggage? "It is in the back room," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound brave. "It is in my locker with my winter coat. But it is my bag, Julian. You have no right to demand it." Julian simply snapped his fingers in the air. The massive driver standing behind him stepped forward. The heavy man cracked his thick knuckles, crossing his tree-trunk arms over his chest. The physical threat was suddenly overwhelming. Julian was clearly not here to negotiate or order food. He was here to break her spirit and take exactly what he wanted. In the back corner of the diner, Wyatt watched the scene unfold with the detached precision of a seasoned military operative. He noted the heavy driver's stance immediately. The large man carried his weight mostly on his right foot, suggesting an old, poorly healed injury to his left knee. He wore a dark jacket that bulged slightly at the left side of his chest, indicating a concealed weapon drawn for a right-handed shooter. Wyatt calculated the exact distance from his booth to the front counter. It was exactly 22 paces. He could cover that ground in less than 3 seconds if he needed to intervene. Beside him, the German Shepherd let out a low, continuous rumble from deep within its chest. The warning sound was barely audible over the hum of the diner refrigerators, but Wyatt felt the vibration distinctly through the floorboards. He placed a calm, steady hand on the dog's head, signaling the highly trained animal to hold its position. They were not ready to engage just yet. Wyatt needed to assess the full scope of the threat before making a move. Julian slammed his flat hand violently onto the counter, making the glass sugar shakers rattle against each other. "I will not ask you a second time, Lydia. Go into the employee break room and bring me that bag." Lydia stood her ground, though her knees were shaking violently behind the counter. "You have no right to come to my workplace and order me around. We are completely finished. You need to turn around and leave right now before I call the police." Julian threw his head back and laughed. It was a cold, humorless sound that echoed harshly off the tiled walls of the diner. "The police? Do you really think the local police care about a late-night waitress complaining about her wealthy ex-boyfriend? My father plays golf with the chief of police every single Sunday. I could burn this pathetic diner to the ground right now, and they would look the other way." The heavy driver chuckled in agreement, a rough sound like gravel grinding together in a mixer. He moved another step closer to the counter, aggressively invading Lydia's personal space. The man was easily 6.5 feet tall, with a flat nose and heavily scarred knuckles that told the story of a man who solved all his employer's problems with brutal physical force. Lydia took a frightened step backward, bumping hard into the heavy metal coffee machine behind her. She looked around the room in desperation, feeling completely trapped. The only other person in the diner was the quiet man with his dog in the back corner. She desperately hoped he would not try to help, fearing he would only get severely hurt by Julian's violent bodyguard. "Please," Lydia whispered, her voice finally cracking under the immense pressure. "Just leave me alone." Julian reached across the counter with lightning speed. His movement was sudden and viciously aggressive. He grabbed Lydia tightly by her left wrist, his long fingers digging into her fragile skin like an iron vise. She cried out in sudden pain and tried frantically to pull her arm away, but his grip was far too strong. "You are making a massive mistake," Julian sneered, pulling her roughly forward against the edge of the counter. "You thought you could just walk away from me. You thought you could take what belongs to me and simply disappear into the night. It does not work that way. You belong to me until I say otherwise." Lydia struggled fiercely against his hold, her rubber-soled shoes slipping on the greasy floor tiles behind the counter. "Let me go right now." "You are hurting me." Julian completely ignored her desperate plea. He did not even look at her face. He turned his head and looked directly at the heavy driver standing nearby. "Go to the back room right now," Julian commanded sharply. "Find her locker or wherever she keeps her trash. Get the leather bag. If anyone in the back tries to stop you, break their jaw." The driver nodded slowly, a cruel, highly anticipated smile forming on his wide face. He turned heavily away from the counter and started walking with heavy, thudding footsteps toward the swinging doors that led to the diner kitchen and the employee break room. Lydia panicked completely. That bag held the last of her cash tips and her apartment keys. More importantly, she realized with a sudden jolt of terror that Julian's obsession with it meant something incredibly dangerous was inside. She twisted her arm as hard as she could, trying desperately to break Julian's grip, but he only squeezed tighter, leaning his upper body over the counter to maintain his physical leverage over her. In the dark back corner of the diner, the dynamic shifted entirely. Wyatt slowly picked up his coffee cup and took one final, deliberate sip. He then set the heavy ceramic mug down on the wooden table. The sharp clack of the cup hitting the wood was surprisingly loud and crisp in the tense, rain-soaked atmosphere. The German Shepherd stood up completely now, its powerful muscles coiled tight under its dark, sleek coat. The dog did not take its intense, focused eyes off the heavy driver walking toward the back room. Wyatt pushed his chair back slowly. The sound of the wooden chair legs scraping loudly against the floor tiles caused Julian to pause and look over his shoulder in irritation. The wealthy young man looked deeply annoyed at the sudden interruption, completely unaware that he had just crossed a dangerous line from which there was absolutely no return. The situation had escalated from verbal intimidation to direct physical violence against an innocent person. Wyatt stepped out of the booth and into the dim light. He did not run. He did not shout any warnings. He simply walked forward with the terrifying, absolute calm of a man who brought the storm with him. Wyatt stepped out of the dim lighting of the back booth. His movements were completely devoid of the frantic energy that currently filled the front of the diner. He walked with a measured and deliberate pace. Each step was solid, quiet, and perfectly balanced. Beside him, the German Shepherd matched his stride flawlessly. The dog did not bark or pull ahead. Pull. It stayed glued to Wyatt's left leg, its ears pinned slightly back, and its dark eyes locked firmly on the threat ahead. To an untrained observer, Wyatt might have looked like just another weary traveler in a faded gray shirt and worn jeans. He did not puff out his chest or clench his fists in an overt display of aggression. He simply closed the distance between the back corner and the front counter, his gaze fixed on Julian's hand, which was still gripping Lydia's wrist. The heavy driver noticed Wyatt first. The large man shifted his weight, turning his broad shoulders to block the narrow aisle between the row of stools and the dining tables. The driver crossed his thick arms, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He clearly thought he was about to intimidate a harmless local who had decided to play hero. Julian finally registered the approaching footsteps. He did not let go of Lydia. Instead, he tightened his grip, causing her to let out a small gasp of pain. He turned his head slowly, looking Wyatt up and down with an expression of profound disgust. Julian saw the simple clothes, the lack of expensive accessories, and the quiet demeanor. He immediately categorized Wyatt as a nobody. "Turn around and go back to your cheap coffee," Julian said loudly. His voice echoed off the tiled walls, filled with a sense of untouchable superiority. "This is a private conversation. If you know what is good for you, you will sit down, keep your mouth shut, and pretend you do not see a thing." Wyatt did not stop walking until he was exactly 6 feet away from the driver. This was the optimal distance, close enough to strike instantly, but far enough to maintain a clear line of sight on both men. He stopped. The German Shepherd stopped instantly beside him, assuming a rigid sitting position without a single verbal command. Wyatt looked directly into Julian's eyes. The contrast between the two men was stark. Julian was vibrating with arrogant anger, his face flushed and his posture rigid. Wyatt was completely still, his expression unreadable, his breathing slow and even. He possessed the terrifying calm of a man who had faced far worse monsters in far darker corners of the world. "Let her go," Wyatt said. He did not shout. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with a quiet, flat authority that cut through the tension in the room like a sharp blade. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders in the middle of a hostile environment. Julian blinked, momentarily taken aback by the sheer confidence in the stranger's tone. Then his arrogance returned full force. He let out a harsh laugh. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to?" Julian demanded, leaning over the counter. "I could buy this entire pathetic town and everyone in it. You are a nobody in a dirty shirt. Walk away before my driver breaks your legs." Lydia struggled against Julian's grip again. "Please," she whispered to Wyatt, her voice shaking with fear. "They will hurt you. Just call the police. I do not want anyone getting injured because of me." Wyatt did not look at her. He kept his focus entirely on the two men. He noted the driver shifting his weight to his right foot again, telegraphing his readiness to attack. "I am not going to ask you again," Wyatt stated calmly, his voice dropping an octave. "Take your hand off her wrist. Now." The absolute lack of fear in Wyatt's voice finally pierced Julian's fragile ego. He let go of Lydia, pushing her roughly backward against the coffee machine. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Wyatt. "Teach this trash a lesson," Julian snapped at his driver. "Put him in the hospital." The heavy driver did not hesitate. He had spent years beating up people who crossed his wealthy employer, using his massive size to crush any opposition. He stepped forward quickly, his massive frame blocking out the neon light from the front window. The driver let out a low, aggressive grunt and swung his right fist in a wide, brutal arc, aimed directly at Wyatt's jaw. It was a heavy punch, powered by sheer muscle mass and cruel intent. A normal man would have been knocked unconscious instantly or suffered broken bones from the impact. Wyatt was not a normal man. He did not block the punch. Blocking would mean absorbing the kinetic energy of a man 50 pounds heavier than him. Instead, Wyatt stepped smoothly inside the arc of the swing. He moved with a blinding speed that completely defied his calm exterior. As the driver's heavy fist sailed harmlessly past his ear, Wyatt raised his left arm, trapping the driver's extended arm securely against his own torso. In the exact same fraction of a second, Wyatt stepped directly behind the driver's injured left knee. The sequence of events happened so fast that Julian barely had time to register the sudden flurry of movement. Wyatt applied a sharp, precise strike to the back of the driver's knee, forcing the massive man's leg to buckle instantly. As the driver's balance collapsed, Wyatt pivoted his hips, using the larger man's own forward momentum against him. Wyatt locked his hands around the driver's trapped arm and twisted his torso sharply. The driver let out a startled yell as his feet completely left the floor. He flew over Wyatt's hip and crashed onto the hard linoleum floor with a sickening thud. The entire diner seemed to shake violently from the massive impact. Before the driver could even process the shocking pain of the fall, Wyatt dropped his weight heavily onto the man's shoulder, pinning him completely to the ground. Wyatt applied a basic but devastating military joint lock to the driver's extended arm. He applied just enough upward pressure on the elbow to make the joint creak audibly in the quiet room. The heavy driver gasped loudly, his face rapidly draining of color as agonizing pain shot through his arm. He tapped his free hand frantically against the floor, completely immobilized and broken by a man half his size in less than 3 seconds. Silence fell heavily over the diner. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of the driver trapped on the floor and the steady drumming of the rain outside the glass windows. The German Shepherd had not moved an inch from its spot. It remained in its seated position, watching the downed man with intense predatory focus, waiting only for Wyatt's command to engage. Wyatt kept his knee firmly planted on the driver's shoulder, ensuring the massive man could not attempt a counterattack. He looked up slowly from the floor and fixed his cold, unwavering gaze on Julian. The wealthy young man was completely frozen in place. The smug, arrogant smile had entirely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. He stared with wide eyes at his massive, highly paid bodyguard, who was now whimpering on the greasy floor tiles, completely helpless. Julian suddenly realized that his immense wealth and his expensive suit meant absolutely nothing in this room. He had brought cheap intimidation to a place that demanded raw survival, and he had just foolishly provoked a man who dealt exclusively in the latter. Wyatt did not smile. He did not boast or gloat about his victory. He just maintained his dominant position, the air around him thick with a silent, undeniable power that promised severe consequences if Julian made even one wrong move. Julian stared at the massive driver groaning on the floor. The shock on his face quickly contorted into pure, unhinged rage. His fragile ego could not handle the humiliation of being overpowered by a man he deemed inferior. His face turned a deep shade of crimson. He took a hasty step backward toward the entrance of the diner, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the damp floor tiles. The rain outside was coming down harder now, washing over the large glass windows in thick sheets. Instead of retreating into the night, Julian slammed his hand against the glass pane of the front door. He shouted into the rainy darkness outside, calling frantically for the rest of his security detail. Within seconds, the heavy front doors swung open, bringing a violent gust of cold wind and rain into the warm diner. 2 more men stepped inside. The first was a tall, wiry man with a completely shaved head and a dark trench coat that flapped around his ankles. His eyes were cold and calculating. The second man was shorter, but built like a cinder block, sporting a thick black beard and a heavy leather jacket. They both possessed the hard look of professional mercenaries hired to do dirty work with no questions asked. They stepped over the threshold and immediately locked their eyes on Wyatt. Lydia crouched low behind the front counter, covering her ears as the diner transformed from a quiet sanctuary into a hostile war zone. She peered terrified over the laminate edge, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She desperately wanted to scream for Wyatt to run out the back door, but she knew the front exit was completely blocked by these massive men. Julian pointed a shaking finger at Wyatt from the safety of the entryway. "Break his legs and tear this place apart," Julian commanded the two new men. "I want that bag." The two bodyguards did not hesitate for a single second. They split apart seamlessly, taking tactical positions on either side of the narrow aisle to flank their target. They clearly expected Wyatt to panic, beg for mercy, or show some sign of fear. Instead, Wyatt stood perfectly still. He released his hold on the first driver, letting the massive man roll away in agony, holding his dislocated shoulder. Wyatt squared his shoulders toward the new threat. He did not adopt a traditional aggressive fighting stance. He just stood there with his hands relaxed at his sides, his center of gravity perfectly balanced. It was a posture that spoke of thousands of hours of relentless combat training. Beside him, the German shepherd let out a sharp bark, shifting its weight and waiting for the singular command that would unleash its raw power. The stocky man with the beard made the first move. He charged forward like an angry bull, lowering his head and attempting to tackle Wyatt around the waist. It was a chaotic, brawling technique that relied purely on brute force and sheer momentum. Against a normal person, it would have been devastating. But Wyatt easily sidestepped the clumsy attack with the grace of a matador. As the heavy man barreled past him, Wyatt brought his elbow down sharply against the back of the man's neck. The strike was calculated and brutally precise, targeting a specific nerve cluster. The bearded man crashed face first into an empty dining table, shattering the thick ceramic coffee mugs that rested on top. The wooden table groaned loudly and collapsed under his weight, sending splinters and broken dishes clattering across the floor in every direction. The man hit the ground hard and did not even try to get back up, completely knocked out cold. The quick, efficient neutralization of the first threat caused the wiry man in the trench coat to pause in his tracks. He realized instantly that they were not dealing with an ordinary civilian. He took a rapid step back, creating distance, and reached quickly inside his dark coat. Wyatt recognized the movement immediately. The man was going for a concealed firearm. Wyatt knew he could not cross the physical distance in time to disarm the man before the weapon cleared the leather holster. He shouted a single, sharp command in a foreign language Lydia did not understand. The German shepherd reacted with terrifying speed. The dog launched itself forward like a dark torpedo, its muscular legs propelling it across the diner floor in a blur of black and tan fur. The wiry bodyguard barely managed to pull a dark pistol from his coat when 80 pounds of highly trained muscle hit him squarely in the chest. The dog slammed into the man with incredible kinetic force, knocking him backward violently into the front window. The heavy pane of glass spiderwebbed with a loud crack but held firm under the impact. The bodyguard shouted in panic, trying to aim the weapon downward, but the dog clamped its powerful jaws firmly around his right forearm. The German shepherd did not bite to tear or maim the flesh. It bit to control. The immense crushing pressure of the dog's jaws completely paralyzed the man's arm. The pistol slipped from his numb fingers and skittered uselessly across the floor, stopping near the front counter where Lydia was hiding. The dog stood proudly over the terrified bodyguard, emitting a low guttural growl that promised severe consequences if he tried to move even an inch. The sudden and total defeat of his expensive security team left Julian completely exposed and entirely vulnerable. He stood near the doorway, watching in absolute disbelief as his hired muscle lay defeated across the diner floor. His mind raced frantically, unable to process the total failure of his intimidation tactics. He could not accept this reality. He could not let this quiet nobody ruin his plans and take away his total control over Lydia. Driven by blind panic, humiliation, and a deeply wounded pride, Julian reached into the pocket of his tailored suit pants. He pulled out a sleek, tactical folding knife. With a quick flick of his thumb, the sharp steel blade snapped open, catching the dim red neon light from the window sign. Wyatt was standing just a few feet away, his back currently turned toward Julian as he quickly scanned the downed men to ensure they were no longer a threat. Julian saw his window of opportunity. He gripped the handle of the knife tightly, his knuckles turning white, and lunged forward. He aimed the lethal steel point directly at the center of Wyatt's unprotected back. He moved silently, his expensive shoes making absolutely no sound on the wet floor tiles. He intended to end the confrontation right then and there. Lydia saw the dangerous glint of the knife from her hiding spot behind the counter. "Wyatt, look out behind you!" she screamed, her terrified voice tearing through the tense air of the diner. But Wyatt did not even need the warning. The German Shepherd, while actively pinning the wiry bodyguard to the floor, possessed an incredible situational awareness. The dog's sharp eyes caught Julian's sudden aggressive movement. Without a moment of hesitation, the highly trained animal released the man on the floor and spun around with incredible agility. Just as Julian raised the knife to strike the final blow, the German Shepherd leaped high into the air. The dog tackled Julian hard from the side, its heavy paws hitting his chest and knocking him completely off balance. The dog's jaws snapped shut like a steel bear trap right over Julian's right wrist. Julian screamed loudly in sudden, agonizing pain. His fingers went completely limp instantly, and the dangerous folding knife dropped to the floor with a sharp metallic clink. Wyatt spun around casually and placed the heavy heel of his combat boot directly on top of the blade, securing it. The dog stood over the wealthy young man, its teeth still firmly wrapped around his wrist, waiting for Wyatt's next instruction. Wyatt looked down at Julian, who was now cowering on the floor, trembling with genuine fear and crying out for help. "Do not move," Wyatt said with chilling calmness. The fight was definitively over. The loud diner was suddenly plunged back into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of the rain outside and the heavy breathing of the defeated men. The diner remained completely silent except for the heavy rain lashing against the cracked front window. Julian lay sprawled on the greasy floor. His expensive suit was ruined. He was whimpering softly as the German Shepherd kept its powerful jaws firmly clamped around his wrist. The dog did not bite down harder than necessary. It simply applied enough pressure to ensure the wealthy heir could not move a single muscle without experiencing severe pain. Wyatt stood a few feet away. He scanned the room with practiced efficiency. The bearded man was still unconscious near the shattered wooden table. The wiry bodyguard in the trench coat was groaning quietly, clutching his bruised chest where the dog had hit him. The immediate physical threat was neutralized. Wyatt turned his attention back to Lydia. She was still crouching behind the front counter, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief at the sudden explosion of violence that had just occurred in her quiet workplace. Wyatt walked slowly over to the counter and offered her his hand. His expression was calm and reassuring. "You are safe now," he said quietly. "They are not going to hurt you." Lydia hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. His grip was strong and warm. She stood up on shaky legs, looking at the defeated men scattered across the floor. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the storm outside. "I do not even know your name." He gave a small nod. "My name is Wyatt, and this is my partner." He gestured toward the dog, who briefly wagged its tail without breaking eye contact with Julian. Wyatt looked down at the cowering man on the floor. Something about this situation did not make sense to him. Men like Julian were arrogant and controlling, but bringing armed mercenaries into a public diner over a bad breakup was an extreme escalation. People usually reserved that level of violence for protecting assets or hiding secrets. Julian glared up at Wyatt, his face contorted with a mix of fear and desperate anger. "You are a dead man," Julian spat, wincing as the dog growled in response to his sudden movement. "My family will destroy you for this." Wyatt ignored the empty threat. He looked at Lydia. "Where is the bag he keeps talking about?" he asked. Lydia blinked, still struggling to process everything. "It is just an old leather tote bag I bought at a thrift store years ago. I left it in the employee break room when my shift started." Wyatt gestured toward the swinging doors. "Go get it. Bring it out here. Do not open it. Just bring it to me." Lydia nodded quickly and hurried toward the back room. She returned a minute later, holding a worn brown leather bag. It looked completely ordinary. The straps were frayed, and the leather was scuffed from years of daily use. She placed it carefully on the clean section of the front counter. The moment the bag touched the counter, the German Shepherd reacted. The dog released Julian's wrist, leaving the wealthy man to curl into a pathetic ball on the floor. The highly trained animal trotted directly over to the counter. It stood up on its hind legs, resting its front paws near the bag. The dog began to sniff the worn leather intensely. Its nose twitched as it worked its way around the seams and the brass buckles. Then the dog let out a sharp whine and began to scratch frantically at the thick leather bottom of the tote bag. It looked back at Wyatt and gave a single, definitive bark. Wyatt walked over and examined the bag closely. He ran his fingers along the thick bottom panel. "There is a false bottom stitched into this," he noted, tracing a line of uneven threading that did not match the rest of the manufacturer's work. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tactical knife. With a quick, precise motion, he sliced through the heavy threads and pulled back the layer of stiff leather. Hidden inside a flat, hollow compartment at the bottom of the bag was a small silver USB drive. Wyatt pulled it out and held it up under the dim neon light. It was an encrypted military-grade storage device, the kind used to transport highly sensitive data off secure networks. He turned to look at Julian, who was now visibly pale and sweating profusely on the floor. Julian was not looking at Lydia anymore. His panicked eyes were locked entirely on the small silver drive in Wyatt's hand. Lydia stared at the device in total confusion. "What is that?" she asked. "I have never seen that before in my life." Wyatt pocketed his knife. "Do you have a computer in the back office?" he asked. Lydia nodded slowly. "Yes, the manager has an old laptop he uses for inventory and payroll." Wyatt told her to go get it. When she brought the bulky laptop out to the counter, Wyatt quickly booted it up and inserted the drive. A complex password prompt appeared on the screen immediately. Wyatt bypassed the security lock using a specialized decryptor software he carried on his own secure phone, a tool from his active-duty operations. The screen flashed green, and a series of massive digital folders opened on the desktop. The contents were staggering. There were thousands of pages of offshore bank account records, detailed ledgers of illegal money laundering operations, and logistical maps for a massive criminal syndicate. The documents clearly traced the illicit funds directly back to Julian's powerful family and their corporate empire. It was enough evidence to put his entire bloodline in federal prison for the rest of their lives. The realization hit Lydia like a physical blow. She stumbled back against the coffee machine, her hands covering her mouth. "He never cared about me leaving him," she whispered, her voice trembling with a horrifying clarity. "He did not come here tonight because he was jealous or obsessed. He came here because I accidentally took his family's financial records. Julian must have slipped it into the bottom of her oldest bag for safekeeping, thinking she would never notice the extra weight or check the lining. When she abruptly packed her things and left his apartment for good, she unknowingly walked out with the absolute destruction of his entire family empire." A dark, menacing laugh echoed from the floor. Julian was pushing himself up into a sitting position, clutching his bruised wrist against his chest. He looked at Wyatt and Lydia with a twisted, desperate smile. "You think you are so smart," Julian sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "You think finding that drive means you win. You have absolutely no idea what you have just stepped into. My family does not just hire street thugs. I pressed the emergency panic button on my watch the second your mutt attacked my men." Wyatt's eyes narrowed. He looked down at the expensive gold watch on Julian's left wrist. A tiny red LED light was blinking rapidly near the dial. It was a silent distress beacon, broadcasting their exact GPS coordinates to a private security force. Julian let out another harsh laugh, spitting blood onto the tiled floor. "They are already on their way," he said. "A highly trained extraction team. They are going to secure that drive, and then they are going to erase every single person inside this diner. You are not making it out of here alive." Wyatt calmly closed the laptop and handed the silver drive to Lydia. "Put this in your pocket and do not lose it," he instructed her. His voice held no fear, only the cold preparation for the coming storm. The real fight was just about to begin. Wyatt stared at the blinking red light on Julian's expensive watch. The rhythmic pulsing of the tiny LED was a silent countdown to absolute chaos. Wyatt knew exactly what that signal meant. A heavily armed private extraction team was already speeding toward their exact GPS coordinates, and men like that did not leave loose ends or witnesses behind. The quiet diner was no longer a safe sanctuary from the storm outside. It had just become a target. Wyatt immediately shifted his mindset from basic civilian defense to pure military survival. His posture changed, his breathing deepened, and his eyes scanned the room to assess every possible exit, blind spot, and tactical advantage. He turned to look at Lydia. She was still standing near the coffee machine, clutching the small silver drive tightly in her trembling hand. Her face was incredibly pale, and her eyes were wide with genuine terror. She was a young waitress who had just wanted to escape an abusive relationship, and now she was trapped in the middle of a corporate war. Wyatt knew he needed to get her completely out of the main room before the extraction team arrived. He walked over to her, his footsteps completely silent on the greasy floor tiles. "Listen to me very carefully," Wyatt said, his voice steady and calm, leaving absolutely no room for panic. "The men coming for that drive are not going to ask questions. We need to hide you right now. Is there a basement or a secure room in this building?" Lydia swallowed hard, trying to push past the paralyzing fear gripping her chest. She nodded quickly. "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaking. "There is an old wine cellar down below the kitchen. The owner uses it for storage. The door is made of solid oak, and it locks from the inside with a heavy deadbolt." Wyatt gave a short nod of approval. That was exactly what they needed. A fortified position with restricted access. "Go there right now," Wyatt instructed her, gently pushing her toward the swinging kitchen doors. "Lock the door and do not open it for anyone except me. If you hear loud noises or shooting, you get down on the floor and cover your head. Do you understand?" Lydia looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes as the reality of the situation fully sank in. "What about you?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I am going to make sure they do not reach that cellar," Wyatt replied simply. He did not offer false promises or dramatic speeches. He just stated a fact. As Lydia ran through the swinging doors toward the kitchen, Wyatt immediately began to fortify the main dining area. He gave a sharp hand signal to the German Shepherd. The highly trained dog instantly moved away from the cowering Julian and took up a defensive position near the main hallway, its ears pinned back and its teeth bared in a silent snarl. Wyatt walked over to the heavy wooden dining tables, bolted near the center of the room. Using his immense physical strength, he kicked the metal bolts free and flipped the tables over, dragging them toward the front entrance to create a strong, makeshift barricade. He stacked heavy wooden chairs on top of the overturned tables, effectively blocking the main line of sight from the street windows. Julian watched him from the floor, clutching his bruised wrist against his chest. A sick, arrogant smile began to spread across the wealthy heir's face. "You are completely wasting your time," Julian wheezed, his voice dripping with malice. "The men my father hired are ruthless professionals. A few cheap wooden tables are not going to stop them. They are going to tear this entire building apart, and they are going to make you suffer for touching me." Wyatt completely ignored Julian's taunts. He knew the barricade would not stop a dedicated assault, but it would slow the attackers down and force them into a natural choke point right at the front door. In close-quarters combat, controlling the enemy's path of entry was the key to survival. Wyatt turned his attention to the large glass windows at the front of the diner. They were a massive vulnerability, offering anyone on the street a clear view of the interior. He walked behind the front counter and grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the prep area. With a swift, calculated motion, he smashed the overhead fluorescent lights near the windows, raining sparks and shattered glass onto the floor. He systematically destroyed every light source in the front half of the diner, plunging the area into deep, disorienting shadows. He wanted to force the incoming attackers to transition from the bright streetlights outside into a dark, unfamiliar environment, while he controlled the angles from the back. The German shepherd paced silently in the shadows, its incredible senses fully alert. The dog could hear things Wyatt could not. Wyatt. It let out a low, vibrating rumble from deep within its chest, staring intensely at the rainy street outside. The sudden sound of heavy tires screeching violently against wet asphalt cut through the rhythmic drumming of the storm. 3 large black SUVs pulled up abruptly outside the diner, their tires jumping the curb and blocking the street entirely. The vehicles had deeply tinted windows and lacked any visible license plates. The heavy doors opened in perfect unison, and 6 men stepped out into the pouring rain. They were not local street thugs in cheap suits like the ones Julian had brought earlier. These men wore dark tactical gear, heavy Kevlar body armor, and carried short-barreled suppressed automatic weapons. They moved with terrifying military precision, fanning out quickly to surround the perimeter of the building. The leader of the group was a tall, imposing man wearing a tactical helmet and communication gear. He used fluid hand signals to direct his team, pointing 2 men toward the back alley while he and the remaining 3 approached the front entrance. They moved like ghosts in the rain, their weapons raised and ready to fire at the slightest provocation. They were here to execute a clean sweep, retrieve the stolen data, and eliminate every single person inside. Inside the diner, Wyatt watched their tactical approach through a small gap in his wooden barricade. He recognized their movements immediately. They were highly trained private military contractors, dangerous men who operated outside the law and relied on overwhelming firepower to achieve their objectives. Julian saw them through the shattered window and let out a loud, manic laugh from his spot on the floor. "You are dead!" Julian screamed, his eyes wide with desperate triumph. "They are going to kill you, and then they are going to drag Lydia out of whatever hole she is hiding in." Wyatt did not answer the wealthy heir. He simply walked over to the main electrical breaker panel located on the wall behind the cash register. He placed his hand on the heavy metal lever. He waited patiently until the tactical leader outside raised his boot to kick open the front door. Right at that exact second, Wyatt pulled the lever firmly downward. Every single remaining light inside the diner instantly went out. The humming refrigerators died. The glowing red exit signs flickered off. The entire building was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The power lines were cut, the trap was set, and the deadly siege had officially begun. The diner plunged into absolute darkness. Outside, the heavy rain continued to mask any subtle sounds. The sudden loss of power caused a momentary pause from the tactical team outside. Wyatt used that critical second to move. He slipped away from the breaker panel and positioned himself behind the long dining counter, blending entirely into the deep shadows. His breathing slowed to a barely perceptible rhythm. He drew his combat knife, holding the dark steel blade in a reverse grip. Beside him, the German shepherd was completely invisible in the gloom, functioning as a silent extension of Wyatt's own senses. The dog knew the drill perfectly well. It would not attack until commanded or provoked by a direct threat. At the front entrance, the heavy glass doors shattered inward. The loud crash echoed over the storm as the tactical leader kicked his way past the overturned tables. 2 mercenaries followed him inside, their suppressed rifles raised and sweeping the room. The green glow of their night vision goggles pierced the darkness, casting eerie beams across the destroyed diner. They stepped carefully over the groaning forms of Julian's initial thugs. Julian himself was huddled near the corner, too terrified to speak or call out to his supposed rescuers. "Clear the front," the tactical leader commanded in a harsh whisper. "Check the corners." One of the mercenaries moved toward the booth seating on the left side. He moved with practiced caution, sweeping his rifle barrel back and forth. Wyatt waited until the man was completely isolated from the other two. As the mercenary stepped past the edge of the counter, Wyatt struck. He rose from the shadows with terrifying speed. His left hand clamped tightly over the man's mouth to muffle any sound, while his right hand brought the heavy pommel of the combat knife down hard on the base of the mercenary's skull. The man collapsed instantly, his night vision goggles clattering quietly against the tiled floor. Wyatt caught his heavy body and lowered him silently to the ground, taking his rifle and tossing it far out of reach. The tactical leader noticed the sudden absence of his flanker. "Report!" he barked into his headset. When he received only static, he signaled the remaining man in the main room to converge. The two men moved back to back, scanning the darkness frantically. The green beams of their goggles sliced through the air, but Wyatt was already gone. He had moved swiftly through the kitchen swinging doors, setting up a completely new angle of attack. "Go find the girl," the leader ordered the second man. "She has the drive. Tear the back room apart if you have to." The second mercenary nodded and advanced cautiously toward the kitchen. He pushed the swinging doors open with the barrel of his rifle. The kitchen was a dark maze of stainless steel prep tables and hanging pots. Wyatt was waiting near the walk-in freezer. He gave a silent tap against the metal wall. The sound immediately drew the mercenary's attention. The man turned rapidly, raising his weapon toward the noise. That small distraction was exactly all the German Shepherd needed. The dog launched from the top of a low prep counter behind the mercenary. 80 pounds of pure muscle slammed into the man's back, driving him face first into the stainless steel table. The impact knocked the wind entirely out of him, and his rifle clattered loudly to the floor. The dog pinned him down firmly, its teeth snapping just inches from the man's face, forcing him to freeze in absolute terror. Wyatt stepped out from the shadows and quickly bound the man's hands with a pair of heavy zip ties he had grabbed from the kitchen supply shelf. He gave the dog a quick, silent pat on the head to acknowledge the good work. Outside in the back alley, the two mercenaries tasked with securing the rear perimeter grew incredibly impatient. They kicked open the heavy metal back door, entering a narrow storage corridor that connected directly to the kitchen. Wyatt heard the rusty hinges squeal loudly. He moved quickly into the corridor, using the tight space entirely to his advantage. The narrow walls severely restricted their ability to aim their long rifles properly. Wyatt threw a heavy metal flour canister straight at the first man's head in the darkness. The object struck with a loud metallic clang, heavily disorienting the attacker. Before the second man could even react, Wyatt closed the remaining distance. He delivered a brutal sweeping kick to the man's lead leg, bringing him down to eye level, followed by a swift and precise strike to the jaw. Both men in the rear corridor were completely incapacitated in less than 10 seconds. Wyatt had successfully neutralized 4 highly trained military contractors using nothing but stealth and close-quarters combat. But the tactical leader was not a fool. Hearing the muffled scuffle from the kitchen, the leader realized his elite team was being systematically dismantled by an unknown force. He reached onto his tactical vest and unclipped a small cylindrical canister. It was a military-grade smoke grenade. He pulled the pin and tossed it through the swinging doors. Thick gray smoke hissed violently from the canister, rapidly filling the kitchen and the hallway leading down to the basement. Wyatt had to retreat slightly, covering his mouth to avoid inhaling the blinding chemical fumes. The thick smoke neutralized his visual advantage and made it incredibly difficult for the German Shepherd to track scents effectively. The tactical leader pulled down a specialized thermal imaging visor over his helmet, giving him a distinct and deadly advantage in the blinding smoke. The leader moved methodically through the dense haze, his rifle raised and ready. The thermal imaging picked up the residual heat signatures on the floor, allowing him to easily bypass his fallen men. He navigated past the kitchen prep area and found himself standing directly in front of the heavy oak door that led to the wine cellar. He noticed the fresh scratch marks near the handle and the solid deadbolt engaged securely from the inside. He smiled grimly beneath his heavy mask. "Come out right now!" the leader shouted, his amplified voice echoing terrifyingly through the smoke-filled corridor. "I know you are hiding down there. Open the door and hand over the drive, or I will start shooting through this wood until nothing is left alive inside." Inside the dark cellar, Lydia huddled in the farthest corner, covering her ears tightly and crying quietly. She heard the heavy boots pacing right outside the door. She clutched the small silver USB drive tightly against her chest, hoping desperately that Wyatt was still okay. Wyatt was nearby, crouching low in the thick smoke just a few feet away from the corridor entrance. He could barely see the faint outline of the tactical leader standing in front of the cellar door. A direct frontal assault was far too risky right now. The leader had a thermal visor and his finger was tight on the trigger of a fully automatic weapon. If Wyatt moved even an inch, the man would see his heat signature instantly and fire. Wyatt needed a massive distraction, something that did not produce a heat signature, to throw the leader off balance for just one crucial second. He looked down at the heavy combat knife in his hand, calculating the exact distance and the precise angle required to end this deadly standoff once and for all. The thick gray smoke severely restricted visibility in the narrow corridor. The tactical leader stood in front of the heavy oak door, his thermal imaging visor giving him a false sense of absolute superiority. He held his suppressed automatic rifle tightly against his shoulder, perfectly prepared to fire a steady stream of bullets through the wood if the Waitress did not surrender the encrypted drive. Wyatt was crouched just a few feet away in the dense haze. He knew he could not engage directly while the thermal visor was active. Any sudden movement would light up on the mercenary's screen like a flare. Wyatt needed to create a blind spot. He felt around the floor near the kitchen prep station and found a large, heavy fire extinguisher mounted low on the wall. He unhooked it silently. He knew the thermal visor detected heat, but a sudden blast of freezing carbon dioxide would temporarily blind the sensor. Wyatt looked at the German shepherd hiding under a stainless steel table. He gave a sharp, silent hand signal pointing to the top of the serving counter. The highly trained dog understood instantly. It crept silently through the smoke and leaped onto the high wooden bar counter, positioning itself directly above the tactical leader. Wyatt gripped the fire extinguisher tightly, pulled the safety pin, and prepared to breach the deadly standoff. Wyatt rolled horizontally across the open hallway, depressing the handle of the fire extinguisher as he moved. A massive cloud of freezing white chemical foam erupted into the narrow corridor. The extreme drop in temperature instantly overwhelmed the mercenary's thermal imaging visor. The leader's digital screen flared with chaotic static, rendering him completely blind for a crucial 2 seconds. He cursed loudly and took a step back, pulling the heavy visor off his face to rely on his natural eyesight. That single moment of distraction was all the German shepherd needed. The dog launched itself from the high bar counter like a guided missile. 80 pounds of muscular fury crashed directly into the mercenary's chest. The dog's powerful jaws snapped shut over the man's forearm, exactly where he held the grip of his rifle. The immense crushing pressure forced the leader to drop the weapon instantly. The heavy gun hit the floor and slid away into the smoke. The mercenary shouted in panic and tried to throw the dog off, reaching for a tactical knife strapped to his chest rig. Wyatt was already there. He closed the distance in a fraction of a second. Wyatt delivered a devastating palm strike to the side of the leader's neck, disrupting the blood flow to his brain. As the massive man stumbled sideways, Wyatt swept his legs from underneath him and pinned him brutally to the floor, securing his arms behind his back with heavy plastic restraints. The fight was definitively over. Wyatt stood up slowly and cleared the immediate area, checking the vital signs of the unconscious mercenaries to ensure none of them posed a lingering threat. The diner was quiet again, save for the hiss of the dying smoke grenade and the steady rhythm of the rain outside. Wyatt walked over to the shattered front windows. Down the street, the distant wail of police sirens began to echo through the wet city blocks. Wyatt had taken a specialized communication radio from one of the downed guards earlier. He had used it to contact his own military command post, relaying the situation and the existence of the financial records to federal authorities. The local police were not coming to investigate a simple noise complaint. A fully mobilized federal task force was descending on the diner to dismantle Julian's entire criminal empire. Wyatt turned away from the window and walked back through the ruined dining room. Julian was still huddled in the corner, clutching his broken wrist. The arrogant, wealthy heir was sobbing quietly, completely broken by the absolute destruction of his highly paid private army. Wyatt ignored him completely and walked down the hallway to the wine cellar. He knocked 3 times on the heavy oak door, paused, and knocked twice more. It was the all-clear signal. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly, and the door slowly creaked open. Lydia stood in the doorway, trembling uncontrollably. She held the small silver USB drive tightly in her hand. She looked past Wyatt and saw the smoke, the overturned tables, and the unconscious armed men scattered across the floor. Wyatt stepped forward and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You are completely safe now," he said quietly. "It is over?" Lydia let out a long, shuddering breath and stepped out into the hallway. Within minutes, the diner was swarming with law enforcement. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the destroyed interior. Federal agents secured the building, systematically dragging the handcuffed mercenaries out to armored transport vehicles. 2 officers pulled a screaming and crying Julian off the floor, reading him his rights as they marched him out into the rain. A senior federal investigator approached Lydia and Wyatt. The agent carefully took possession of the encrypted drive, assuring Lydia that the evidence inside would ensure Julian and his entire family would spend the rest of their natural lives in federal prison. The agent thanked Wyatt for his service and his incredible tactical intervention, promising that Lydia would receive full witness protection and a fresh start far away from this city. The storm finally broke as dawn began to approach. The dark clouds parted, allowing the first golden rays of sunlight to hit the damp city streets. The cold rain was replaced by a warm, promising morning glow. Lydia sat on the lowered tailgate of an ambulance outside the diner. A paramedic had draped a thick thermal blanket over her shoulders, but she was no longer shivering. The German shepherd sat right beside her on the wet asphalt. The dog rested its large head gently on her lap, offering quiet comfort after a night of terrifying violence. Lydia smiled for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She wrapped her arms around the dog's thick neck, burying her face in its soft, dark fur. Wyatt stood nearby, watching the sunrise over the city skyline. His posture was relaxed, his duty fulfilled. Lydia looked up at him, her eyes filled with immense gratitude. She reached her hand out from under the blanket. Wyatt stepped closer and took her hand in his. His grip was warm, solid, and incredibly grounding. She did not have to say a word. In the quiet golden light of the morning, surrounded by the remnants of her past, Lydia knew she was finally free. She had survived the darkest night of her life, and as she looked at the quiet soldier and his loyal dog, she knew her new beginning was going to be beautiful. The story of Wyatt, his loyal German shepherd, and Lydia reminds us that true power does not reside in wealth or arrogance. Real strength is quiet. It is the courage to step out of the shadows and protect those who cannot protect themselves. Julian built his fragile empire on intimidation, but it crumbled in a single night when it faced genuine discipline and unbreakable loyalty. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones sitting quietly in the corner, waiting for the moment they are needed most. If this story of justice and bravery inspired you, please share this video with your friends and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories just like this one. May abundant blessings find their way into your life, and may you always be surrounded by protection and peace. If you believe in the power of goodness and standing up for what is right, please comment Amen below.